I'm so excited. I'm so excited to be here this evening. We're live. I think the button actually just came on. It is time for another SPSM, and some of you are just getting over all of the events that you've been traveling to, and I know that you've been there because I've been there too. So I want to give a big shout out to a couple people. I want to give a big shout out to Sean Erriger. Did I say that right? Like Tiger Erriger?
You're better. You're getting better.
For once?
Better.
And if you've got a name, I'm going to mess it up, right, Sean? Right, Josh? No, it's Bart. We're going to confuse our guest. So who presented at NatCon this week with Dana Lewis, who just finished modding the Hickson chat, and of course to Ann Becker-Schutte, who was one of the Twitter ambassadors at NatCon, and we had a gazillion SPSMers at NatCon, to Shy Lewis, who I was with in upstate New York this week. Big shout out to Shy, and to Amelia, Atos84, who may have seen every SPSMer this week through Unicorn Magic. Right? If you don't know, I am at Doc Foreman. We are going to be talking about data science. I know, it's a running theme, but for reasons this spring. And we have a wonderful guest tonight, but before I do that, I want to introduce this guy down here, our technology moderator, Tony. Say hello.
Hi, everybody. At ADWWW. If you have a question for our guest, please tweet at me directly, and I'll try to get him to answer you.
I did get Sean's name right. I love you, Sean. I've been only working on that for 3 years. And we have our co-moderator, Dr. Bart Andrews, who's gone from Las Vegas to D.C. somehow.
Yeah, Rockville.
And
Rockville's claim to fame is they have 4,600 parking spots in downtown Rockville. So they've got signs up letting you know that there's ample parking in Rockville. I don't have a car, so I won't be availing myself of the ample parking. Good to be on the show tonight. Very excited about our guest. Very excited to be back from NatCon, where my boss, the amazing Pat Coleman, received a Visionary Leader Award. So the whole NatCon conference was amazing. Got to connect with lots of cool folks. And I'm really excited about the show tonight. I want to hear more about data science because, as you know, you can never get enough data science.
And I'm going to not mess up the difference between database and data set. Tony is laughing on the Twitters. But
What's the difference? What's the difference?
And let's introduce our guest. We have Eric Liu, the executive director of Bayes Impact, the parent not-for-profit of Bayes Hack, and he's going to be telling us the difference. Eric, what is the difference between a database and a data set? He's going, why did I do this?
Well, hey, that was a good deferral. I like that. I appreciate it. Well, April, thanks so much for having me on the show. I'm really excited to talk to you and everybody today about some of our work in innovation in the suicide prevention space, but just about data science broadly, and maybe some education into the difference between a data set and a database. A database is a place where the data is stored. Mm-hmm. And a data set is oftentimes something you extract out of that database.
So like a database is like the house, and the data set is the family that you pull out of that house when you are busily forcibly exterminating them. That's not right. That's mildly inappropriate. Did you get it though? Did you get it, Bart?
Oh, yes, something like that.
It was very Trumpy. It was very Trumpy.
Sometimes you want to do that with some data sets. So.
Eric, tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do. And Glenn Coppersmith, I'm not going to say Copperfield, I always want to ruin that too, is shouting out. So tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Sounds good. I am the executive director of Bayes Impact. We are a 501c3 nonprofit, and we're based out of San Francisco. And the mission of our organization is to use data science to address some of the most pressing public interest problems we have today. And as an organization, we're mainly software engineers, data scientists out here in Silicon Valley, building software solutions using data science to help people. And part of that is bringing communities together. So when we run events like hackathons, it's about education and it's about spurring innovation.
So we're so excited to talk about hackathons, and I want to tell you, Eric, just a cute little story about my pal Richard McKeon. Dr. Richard McKeon is the chief of suicide prevention for SAMHSA, which is sort of the big government mental health agency. And so they were checking in about the hackathons, and he said, we've had a hackathon, and he says, I don't think that I can say really in a really detailed way what a hackathon is, but I know Doc Foreman probably knows. Like this much. But if you were going to give Richard McKeon a really good sort of description about what a hackathon really is, what would you say that is?
Yeah, you know, a hackathon is it's an event that if you have enough pizza and soda, engineers will come out and build stuff for free. So that is maybe one of the things to say about it.
That's all it takes.
Yeah. That's right. But more in a more serious manner, a hackathon is really a defined period of time and event where, let's say, in like 12 hours or 24 hours, engineers come to try to build prototypes, software, think about problems. And when we work on hackathons, it's really for specific social issues. For example, like suicide prevention is a big area that we care about, and mental health. And so we set up a place, usually a large room with, pizza, with soda, with a bunch of internet cables running everywhere, for people to come in and think about these problems, think about some of the biggest challenges that we can solve, and then build prototypes, present it to a panel of folks at the end of the day, usually domain experts that can understand sort of the context, and then use that as a way to show how you can bring together software engineers and data scientists and work on problems, at least for us, that they really, I don't know how many of them work on mental illness or suicide prevention, especially for veterans, which is one of the things that we care about a lot, but it is a good way to bring together community to build something tangible.
So now when I have a lot of pizza and soda at my house, I generally am not solving the problems of the world. We are just having a good time. So when you are having a lot of people over and there's pizza and there's soda and there's a lot of internet cables, what happens at the hackathon that gets somebody, like what do you do to get someone to generate something that complicated?
So I think, it might, now there's like a history of hackathons, which is probably helpful to talk about, but hackathons in the beginning were just a place for engineers to come together and build whatever. Usually the task is like, build something cool. Maybe has an impact on one thing or the other, but it could be, fix up a toaster and do something crazy with it, right? Or build something for really any XYZ problem. But now where we see a lot of impact in hackathons is actually focusing on a very specific domain, right? And for us, when we look at social good areas, the hackathons we run are actually very different, I think, than the many hackathons in terms of incentives. Because most hackathons are, hey,
wait a minute, there are prizes?
No, there you go. So there are prizes for most hackathons. At least I would say the earlier versions of hackathons that are very just focused on building cool stuff is you incentivize them with money or prizes or a bunch of different tech gear, and whoever builds the coolest thing wins some stuff.
So so this is exactly like a party at my house, in that there is pizza, there's soda, I've got merch, I've got prizes, but somehow these folks build things that can change history. No small thing, right?
Some of them. I think it depends on the one of the hackathons. I think in some of the hackathons you end up building some really fun stuff. But I think what we want hackathons as an environment to be is one where you can build really impactful things. And one thing I'll say about our hackathons, and I think really where a lot of value comes out of these hackathons, is actually if you don't provide prizes. Like when we ran our hackathon, this might be jumping ahead a little bit, but we ran a suicide prevention hackathon with the White House in November. It was a one-day event, and DJ Patel and we got 60, 70 engineers were coming out to work on this event. We told them that there are no prizes for this event. There's no winners for this event. You're going to come in, you're going to spend the whole day, and you're going to build stuff because you care about this issue. And that sort of incentive, I think, is deeply rooted. And that's where you can get a lot of great engagement to build stuff when you're really thinking about the mission and not so much like, can I get the $5,000 end prize?
You mean people will solve social problems if you give them enough pizza and coffee and soda because they find that rewarding?
That's
intrinsically.
Right.
Bart, I can't. This is crazy. Bart.
Well, I mean, it's amazing. The feed is just popping
I know.
People are just grooving on this, Eric, tremendously. And the idea that people would just come together to solve a problem because there's a problem to be solved, and just doing that out of the goodness of their heart is just very, very cool and touching. I think we've talked on this show quite a bit that mental health has tried to solve its problems in a very insular way. And has attacked problems in a very insular way, and we have not been multidisciplinary at all. In fact, we're not very connected to the tech industry. And I think
we don't even talk to each other very much.
No, not great. No, and when we do, we often end up getting pissed at each other. So, and one of the things that Doc Foreman has been amazing about is connecting the SPSM group, mental health professionals, with folks like you, which I think is so important. So one of the questions that came out, like with a hackathon, I'm assuming that people show up with a question in mind. We're not just saying, hey, come together and help us solve a problem. People know what problem they're going to be coming for. How do you guys decide that? How does that happen? How do you guys say, oh, we're going to tackle suicide? How does that even occur?
That's a really good question, and this also leads into what I think would be a good follow-up point, which is, some of the difficulty in putting together an event like this when we think about data, right, and getting access to data for open innovation. But the first part of it is when, as Bays, and also it's a very personal issue that I care about when we think about, mental health, right, is an area that data science now has I think a ton of impact or potential impact to understand behavior, human behavior. And that's the thing about data science from a scalable perspective. It's really a mix of statistics and software, right? That, in essence, is what data science allows. But data science basically provides an automated way to really understand an individual and the way that they behave. And mental health is a very complex issue where behavior is very key, but influenced by a ton of different factors, right? And what data scientists are great at is sort of using data to tease out those factors that are complex but potentially very influential. So that's why we, as Bays, really care about mental health. Now, for the mental health hackathon we ran with the White House, that's a big push coming from the Office of Science and Technology Policy, focused on veterans, focused on preventing suicide, using innovation to do that. So the White House reached out to us to help host the San Francisco hackathon, working with DJ Patel over there. And we put that together, overlapped with a lot of what we care about. And so that's how we chose that theme for that hackathon.
And just a heads up so that our SPSMers know, at AAS16, hashtag AAS16, they're going to have someone from DJ Patel's office who is going to be addressing folks exactly about this initiative, that we are being heard that suicide is a major public health problem, and the major public health problem that is not budging. On the top 10 list, we're just really not getting any traction with this problem like we really need to. And so this is what they're doing. They're encouraging people like Eric to lead the charge using data science to talk about human behavior in complicated ways. So, for example, we're going to have Craig Bryan on the show to talk, I know again, but he's such a favorite, to talk about some very important research that he's got coming out. And one of the things that they find using data science applications on people's social media data is that predicting someone's suicide has a much more complex mathematical formula than you would be able to sort of get intuitively. But in fact, we might be able to predict a suicide, something that just hasn't been possible because the technology and the data science just wasn't there, and in the last few years it was. And the data scientists, folks out there watching, the data science is the folks who are running that industry are interested in working with us on this project. But like you guys know, it's been this sort of process of getting us to all talk the same language or just know each other's faces so we know how to collaborate. With that in mind, Eric, were there any special challenges when you decided? I know that you do not data science in the not-for-profit world for social good in a lot of areas. When you decided to stick your foot into the water of mental health, what kind of unique challenges of teaming or collaborating with mental health field did you start to find?
Yeah, that's a good question, and one of the difficulties in hosting that event was really getting access to data across the spectrum, from aggregate data to individual level data, because it's a very sensitive issue. It's one where getting access to very private information about an individual's mental health is something that should be held very carefully, and I think the careful balance of allowing for innovation but also protecting somebody's privacy is one of the unique challenges of health in general, but I think mental health specifically is one where that is an important issue. So when we were hosting this event, and even with a lot of our mental health efforts, it's about being able to open data in a secure way that is granular enough to still allow interesting things to be done. And I can get into some specifics there, but I think that's the broad thought. Is it's both a mix of a technology challenge in terms of data collection and opening up data sets from an infrastructural level, as well as policy in terms of having researchers have an easy way to access data, anonymized data, for example.
Wait a minute. Are you saying that HIPAA makes it kind of difficult to save people's lives? I'm shocked. I love you, HIPAA. I'm not going to violate you. I'm totally compliant. But folks, very truly, because people don't understand how HIPAA works, or because of how it has been set up in the past, it really wasn't set up with these sort of technology applications in mind. And so there actually is no really good way to build these databases and then to grant really qualified researchers who could make innovative progress quickly with these databases. There's no easy way to get them access, right, Eric? Like, how long does it take for you to get to a data set, and then once you do, then what happens?
Right, so we're working with, and this is in a separate project, but this goes to show, right, some of the difficulties in terms of accessing data. So when we look at patient records, we are working with Sutter Health in the Bay Area. They have about 26 hospitals. We're getting access to data to predict a variety of different things, from heart failure to pneumonia, and getting access to that data took about a year of IRB and HIPAA compliance and all those sorts of things to get personal individual data, which I think does need that level of scrutiny. However, there is this realm of data sets, especially for the mental health hackathon and these innovation events, where we don't need the level of detail where you're having individual diagnosis codes for everybody. But what would at least be helpful is even access to, in a machine-readable way, access to the number of people, for example, that are committing suicide or have mental health issues. Even the counts, right, and distribution across certain geographies is hard to access. These systems exist, but one of the projects was even how do we get access to like the National Violent Death Reporting System easier, because the query system online was something so hard for our participants to work with. Like those fundamental things is a definite frustration and potential limitation for our work.
Bart, we all had several reactions when we talked about just getting access to a geolocated map with counts of suicide deaths. What was your reaction, Bart?
Well, I mean, I just had a recent conversation with state-level officials, and it's interesting because I'm pushing to get real-time or close to real-time suicide data across the state of Missouri. And one of the folks was saying, well, we already got 14 data. Getting more recent data doesn't help anybody. The data we have is recent enough. And I was stunned. So there's so much tunnel vision around data around suicide in the first place that what good is it? What good is having live data? And I think that we need to have much better data streams. So I asked, well, what things do we get real time? So here's what's really interesting. We get real-time traffic fatality data. That's reported across the state, right? There aren't as many traffic fatalities as there are suicide.
Wait a minute. So we're doing this for traffic and not suicide?
Yes, because traffic is different, April. And so I'm pushing for that, but there's a tremendous amount. So the hard part is that recognizing that suicide is a public health issue. And I think this gets up against a lot of the prejudice and discrimination. People do really subscribe to the myth that if people want to kill themselves, you can't stop them. Why would we be that interested in the data? Because these folks are going to do it anyway. we all know that that myth should have been debunked by now, but it hasn't. The other thing, and I saw this, Eric, there was an article about the hackathon in San Francisco. That's, I think, one of the things that psychology has really struggled with. We've been so internally focused on inner psyche stuff that the methods that behavioral economicists, is that our word, economicist?
Economist?
Behavioral economist. That's probably better, don't you think?
No, I like your way.
Behavioral economicist? It's sexier. Behavioral economists. Those sorts of procedures, those sorts of techniques will be much more powerful in helping us prevent suicide and learn more about suicide. So we need to start getting into the mindset that you're taking, Eric, which we've got to look at these big data pools and look at how people are behaving and where do we find that data. I think that leads us to social media. I think it's going to be very difficult. I think it's going to be years before we have an online national system that gives us really good data on suicides across the country. I'm fairly pessimistic about it.
I want to just propose something really quickly, and then I would love to hear Eric comment on this. It's related to this theme. So one of the things that I got several messages about in the last couple of days were I think is it Manitoba and the First Nation community in Manitoba, and I don't know if you've heard about this, Eric, but they've had a community that it has had an alarming number of suicides and suicide attempts. In a relatively small population, I think they've had 6 or 8 deaths, and they've had like 150-ish attempts, something like that, Bart.
Yeah.
And the problem is that the CDC's data and the analysis of reports about like what to do about suicide or where to direct resources, all of those, I mean, and I can't say what happens in Canada, but I can say that in the United States, those usually come every 2 years, and it takes a long time to get that data. But if you're living in this First Nation area in Manitoba, you have mortalities going on now and that people don't understand. And so, of course, someone messaged me and she said, what should we be doing from that area? She said, she said, I don't know if you remember me. I came to one of your presentations. This is happening now, and we are totally overwhelmed. And these communities, geolocated, so we're not just individual health, but then population health. What do we do when there's been a change in the population's mental health? And I'm wondering what you guys think about that story.
You know, it's interesting because it's a story that I think it exists at a local level, but it's also systemic across the U.S., right, in terms of getting access to data in order to understand the situations. And one of the things that we found within our, when we were doing the hackathon, is really recognizing where the gaps in data are, right? Because the most important part about data, it's not the data itself, but it's the questions that you want to answer or what you want to do with it, right? And what's good to have a pair of fresh eyes, or in this case, 50, right, to look at this problem, is to say, well, what if we could do X, Y, Z? Like, can we answer these questions, right? And noticing those gaps is actually one of the most interesting outcomes that came out of our event, is giving this feedback to the VA. And so one thing that we did that I think is pretty unique from other hackathons is we brought in 7 experts from the VA, some from DC and some from the San Francisco VA, to come in, suicide prevention coordinators, innovation specialists, those sorts of folks to take this sort of feedback and say, well, where are the gaps in terms of data? And how do we improve that? Because it's not just a technology issue if we need better databases and we need better ways for people to input data, but it's also a policy challenge, right, of how to collect data, how do you incentivize data collection, how do you release and open data in a smart way that protects privacy, but also provides access to data to answer some of those questions and respond to local crises.
So one of the questions that I want to ask you then, and here's where I'm going to be thoughtful for just a second so that I remain employed. No, so we really do want policymakers to make the collection of data possible, and we want, of course, we love for policymakers to become involved. And we love mental health people to become involved. As a matter of fact, I can't think of a group that I would ever want to hand select, but a bunch of mental health professionals like myself and policymakers to change the rules for getting you a database and a data set, because that'll happen really quickly, and we won't spend a lot of time arguing over the meaning of words and over non-practical, non-effective, non-outcome oriented decisions, except for the fact that we probably will. So if you were wanting to get this done, like not the policymakers being willing, who would actually need to be in the room besides folks like me or like a policymaker who might spend a lot of time agonizing and not producing effective policy? Who would need to be in the room and say, no, do it this way because why, and let's do it quickly? Who would know that?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's about getting the people in the room, but it's also the activities that I think need to be taken, even with the existing people and infrastructure we have today. So first is there needs to be a connection between what is smart policy, the implementation of that policy, then how that implementation is connected with the technology. And in those three buckets, there are a different set of experts for each, right? I think just having the policy alone is good. It's a good start, but we need folks at, let's say, the government agencies, the local agencies that understand, right? The hospitals and the end delivery of care that are there that understand what information to collect that's helpful at a clinical level, but then can also be stored, let's say, at a common data standard at a federal level or at a state level, right? I mean, those people that understand the data collection really well, those within the agency, that is really important because that's where I see the disconnect. And this is not just in health, but this is in a ton of different spaces, right? Where you have policy that says collect X, Y, Z. Then the implementation of the agency that's supposed to go and collect it may or may not actually live in the spirit of the policy, or there's a lot of potential implementation failures. And then you have...
I love how you called that is such a classy thing to say, potential implementation failures. I'm going to use that in conversation, like at home with my husband. I'm like, well, I can see that there may be some potential implementation failures. But yes, things might go wrong. There are many slips between. Yes.
Yeah, and one of the main things that can go wrong is around the tech, right? And so we may have an amazing policy to collect a lot of this information, and we can store it in a database, but people still need to be able to access it, right? And we need to access it in a way that is easy for engineers and data scientists and whoever to go in and pull that data off in a way that they understand it, that can be used easily, that the quality of the data is good. And all these sorts of things, I think, is oftentimes the missing part when we look at policy construction, right, is the disconnect between the technology implementation and the policy implementation. Like, what data schema, right, are we going to use, which is sort of a fancy way to say, like, how would a computer read the data coming out of it, and how would multiple computers across many different agencies read it? And that sort of thought up front is really important, because once we start investing a lot into query systems and databases and all these policies that wrap around it, if it's not easily accessible, once it's all there, once we did all the hard work of collecting it, that's a problem. And so getting all those folks around a table is, I think, really important. But also to think about, like, once we have this group together, we have to think about what we want to collect to answer those fundamental questions, right? We could collect everything, and it could be great because we want to collect everything about... that's what the scraping is an interesting thing. That's sort of a hack that we were talking about this earlier for those on the line, but one of the guys at our hackathon, he was so frustrated with the query system, he just built something that called a scraper that just pulled all the information from the database, the National Violent Death Reporting Database, and then he just recreated the database himself in like an hour, and then built a map on top of it that was actually really helpful.
Have we considered more scraping and less policy? I mean, you're talking like 1 hour to like maybe 18 months. Like, I mean, and actually realistically, like that's what that could take.
We need a different word. Scraping makes me think of pap smear. Every time you say scraping,
me too, but that's weird that you would think of that word, because
it's just every time. Well, pap smears are for men too. Everybody knows that, Foreman. One of the things that that's a privilege that should be shared. Really, you're holding on to it. You don't want to share it.
I'm just keeping you down.
While Eric was talking, who's got this data? Is insurance companies, right? I guarantee you that the insurance industry, all this data that we so desperately want, we want to create, we want to find a way. I guarantee you that these giant insurance companies, particularly life insurance companies, have actuaries that have actually done a lot of this stuff already, but they ain't share it. So I guess one of the questions is how, I mean, that's another area that I haven't heard anybody talking about, because I guarantee you that there are huge, huge databases that have a lot of this behavioral stuff that we're looking at that's already lying around inside these insurance companies, right?
Yeah, that's it. You know, this is not only within mental health, but this is true for the entire health space, right? Is that insurance companies actually have a huge ability to move using data sets, right? Like in the one classic, I'm not a classic example, but well-known example is within like patient readmissions and the ability to take the data that they're collecting from the insurance companies across a variety of different hospitals to predict patients that are at risk of being readmitted for a ton of different cases, and then targeting interventions that are then effectively incentivized by the insurance company. The difficulty is in the incentive, right, to make that data open. Being able to provide some sort of, sort of financial incentive around there is important. But the other thing though is, I think in terms of innovation, is creating new data sets, right? Like the thing about data science that is a limiting factor of data science is ultimately what data you have, right? And when you look at the mental health space, a lot of interesting new companies are coming up and developing data sets that have never existed before, right? Whether you have it coming from your cell phone, for example, like Ginger.io is a really cool company in San Francisco that, with patient consent, is using your phone behavior as a way to try to understand depression and other mental health issues, and of course some of the most severe cases end up in suicide, and that sort of information has really never been collected before, and it actually can be incentivized a lot by insurance companies that are adopting new digital health technologies, that are adopting other sorts of sensors, right, that might be helpful to detect these sorts of things. But really is part of this innovation idea is actually, even if we had access to the best data sets, longitudinal surveys, et cetera, right, we actually may need to supplement it more with more real-time behavioral data, which might actually only be generated through new ways, new innovative methods.
I am all for finding ways for people to collect data, and the truth is that I think that there are many people who would donate their data. So it's like not even, there are many, in many areas of research, and this is one of the things that we've been talking about, or that I've been talking about since, I think, last summer, when people say, I am a suicide attempt survivor, I am at risk of suicide, I want you to have the data for my phone. Like finding a place or a way for people to donate their data, or my son has passed away. I had the real privilege of spending a couple of days sitting next to Sue Klebold, who is Dylan Klebold's mother. Some of you are familiar with who he is from the Columbine shootings. She just released a book and talked about, about in the aftermath of her son's death and the deaths that he inflicted on others, there were a lot of requests for various things, and some of them which felt very, very ghoulish, and some of which were very exploitative. And she said in the middle of all of that, there was a request for her son's brain. And she said, had I known that this person was a legitimate researcher who has the brains of people who died by suicide, who's trying to do some really innovative research, I would have donated it. But in the aftermath of someone's death, knowing that I could hand that data over and that there would be someone who was vetted by others and was a legitimate researcher, she goes, I would have loved to have, if I can't answer the question of why this happened, which is what most families want to know in this aftermath, was how, why, and in the pursuit of answering those questions, they would want to donate this data, but there isn't really a way for people to do that yet, and it wouldn't be well enough understood so that someone could say in the immediately following a death, we know that this is a really hard time. You can make a difference for other families by making a donation, much like we do with other things. And I wondered if you had thought about anything like that.
That's a really great thought, and it brings me to one about sort of data collection and end delivery of help, which goes outside the realm of data science, right? Which is you ultimately want to use this information to help people, right? And it's the end goal is not just to collect more data, but it's to use this data to do something with it, right? And in the same way that you want to be able to have people to voluntarily contribute their data, you need a sort of easy way to do that, right? Easy and safe way to do that. In the same way that if I have all these databases and I have all these really, sophisticated algorithms, we need to use that information to make informed decisions that people understand. And both of these require, I think, interfaces, right? You could think of it as software, or it could help a clinician or whoever think about these problems easier. But that level of thinking is really important because I don't think that the data science stuff gets conflated with just the fact that it's like sophisticated and data science-y, right? But a lot of these models are actually very simplistic. We're not doing really crazy deep learning stuff for the most part, right?
Although we want to.
Well, that's another. There's an algorithmic regulation problem that we can probably talk about. Some people will fall asleep if we talk about those sorts of things.
This crowd's into it. I'm just going to tell you that right now.
Right? Like if you have a if you have a logistic regression where you can sort of understand why something is happening X or Y, that's a good thing, right? But if you want to get a lot more predictive or a lot more analytical, and you're using sophisticated models with a ton of different variables around it, right? And this is the black box algorithm where for a doctor they're like, great, this person looks like high risk. It's telling me because of ABC reason, but how do I know that, right? Like how is the model doing what it's supposed to do? And when you look at a really, really big data set, or you're able to use techniques like deep learning and those sorts of things, which for example, are used to like just recently, right, with the Go matches that are happening, and DeepMind at Google has beat some of the best players in the hardest board games, right, known to man in terms of for computers, right? That's a huge win. But now people are thinking about, well, how do these models really work, right? And that sort of difficulty goes to the original point of how do we think about using data science in practice, right, in application. And one of the things that we focused on a lot at the hackathon, and also continuing with any of our work, is when we have software engineers in a room that, they're not data scientists, but they can think about how somebody might actually get the output of these models, right, of the data science being produced. So like, you should do this and not that, right? Like those simple decisions should come out in a way that people can understand, whether it's a mobile application or a website or something decision support for a clinician, whatever it is. But we want to think about those applications and then go back into what model do we want to develop, what data sets do we need to collect. And that's when we can say, if we're going to a mother and saying, hey, give us all this data about your kid, right? We want to know that's being used for the right reasons. I don't want to collect a ton of different things that don't matter. I want to collect things that can be helpful to answer these specific questions, to deliver help to avoid those things from happening again. And that's where it's the magic of combining. You have smart data science, good software behind it, and then people. You need the delivery of that to tie into how care is actually given to someone. And I think that's really important for these discussions that can get lost in the complexity of whatever algorithm that we're using to optimize a certain outcome.
Yeah, we want this data science to work, and we want the things that are developed to solve the problem. And the reason we want to do that is because I would like to be able to look at a family and say, this is what happened, and be able to explain it. Because right now I don't really know if I have a good enough. I don't know if there was a good enough explanation. But even better, I would like to be able to walk into a room in a clinic and say, this is why we believe that your son or daughter needs help tonight, and this is what we're going to do to keep your son or daughter alive until they get well and recover. This is a little complicated, but I'm going to walk you through it. And the good news is we have a lot of information, and I have a plan. That's what I would like to be able to do.
Right, and it all is like about the human aspect of it, right? I think algorithms making a decision without a person, especially when it comes to health, is very troubling. In the sense that, like, if we just followed whatever the algorithm said, even though it may be right, most of the time, we want somebody there to really being able to understand the context and provide support for a human, and not make all these sort of immediate decisions or the final decisions there, which is, I think, something that, particularly in the health space, is one of the biggest considerers, both from a regulatory standpoint and an actual implementation standpoint, of something that needs to be considered once we get very sophisticated models that are hard to understand.
Bart, the feed is blowing up. You have any?
Yeah, I'm trying to get. I mean, people are just so they're all this. I mean, we've got real-time data. What questions are we asking about this data? What do we do with all this? And I think that Eric has asked some really good questions. One of the things that Tom Cruise was sharing a site with us. This new veterans, some kind of a networking. Tony, what was that called? Do you remember? April, did you see that? What was that new kind of like a veterans networking app? One of the things that was really cool. I noticed when
Guard Your Buddy, or that's
new.
Prevail. That's Prevail?
That's the brand new thing that was in the Facebook chat with Tom. Spin.com or spin.org or something.
Yeah. So one of the things, I mean, when I was on that site, I was just sitting on that site for a minute, and instantly the site reached out to me and said, hey, right now we're not available, but message us and we'll see what we can do. So it attended to me. The site attended to me, right? One of the things that we know about suicide is that it's very time sensitive. It's something that tends to ebb and flow. It isn't a chronic, I'm at risk all the time at this level. My risk can move up and down very quickly.
And your very, very high risk is actually a very constrained period of time. That's hard to predict.
It's very constrained, and so it's this whole idea of how do we interrupt the process? Because when people get in that tunnel vision, when they start in that, when that wave, whatever that wave is, hits, what is the wave, and how do we interrupt? And I think more and more, as Eric's talking, the idea that we'd have real-time reads on that. And I think that the false positive rate is still going to be unacceptably high. You're not going to be able to use this to say this person's definitely going to die, and we can restrain them, right? I don't think we're ever going to get to the point where the false positive is livable, right? But we could do things that could interrupt, right? But I think so. I'm just thinking out loud. We know that when people are attended to, that their environment. And changing their environment is how you break people out of that intense place they're in. Does it always work? Well, sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't, but it's a chance. So as Eric's talking, I'm thinking about, and remember Radar, trying to identify people from their Twitter feed, and we notify people in their environment. I don't think that thing's going to fly. I don't think that sort of thing is going to fly. People don't want other people intruding. But, I don't think so. But
I think we're going to end up doing a version of that, but that didn't sit right with people. But anyway,
it didn't. But using data as a way to understand what's going on with people, and then having triggers or things like this gaming software, so that you can start using. I think artificial intelligence is going to play a role in this, in terms of how you at least engage people initially. And then give them options to interrupt that process. But that's just where my brain's kind of floating all over the place as Eric's talking. Because
we do have a question. We do have a question from Mark Demore, and hopefully I got your name right, Mark. He said, "Question: Isn't this data that we've been talking about retrospective? How can we create prospective data from data sets?" And wondered if you had any thoughts about that, Eric.
Yeah, that's interesting, because this is also something generally within health, right? Where we try to understand a lot of how to predict something through some retrospective data set. We might do something fancy in terms of trying to understand a natural experiment or something in order to get a result. When you're talking about generating prospective data, there's the idea of running a prospective study because we have some intervention that makes sense. And then if you take the idea of prospective information, I think the key is what you said, is if things are very time sensitive, right? If it's very hard to collect this information when somebody's at the bottom of their emotional state, that is one of the biggest difficulties with addressing an issue like this, because behavior is very hard to understand when the person that you're trying to predict is not giving you any data, right? Like they're not. There's a stat, you guys will know the percentage very well, but many people that kill themselves week before, they will go to a doctor, right? And
the day before,
right,
like 24 hours even.
Right. And so what do you do about that when you're not really able to, for the doctor, maybe they know, maybe they don't, right? Maybe they're asking questions that seem much less severe than what they actually are. What is then your diagnosis for something that is very much a hidden illness, right? And that's where I think when people are more, if there's an ability to be more comfortable with sharing data, right, at a individual level. And this one takes a lot of individual patient consent. But can we provide channels for people that are suicidal to voice their concerns, right? And this is like the crisis text line, right, or the veteran crisis line. And I think the crisis text line is opening up their data set, or has already started opening up their data set to researchers. These sorts of things make a ton of sense because you're going out and when you don't want to talk to anybody, right? Even friends are alienating at that point. But maybe you talk to somebody over text, right? It actually, the impersonal nature actually helps you have some sort of communication. And while you don't have the best training data, which means the end outcome, like you may not know if that person died or not, maybe they responded, maybe they didn't, there could potentially be some heuristics for you to understand that better. And so platforms like this, whether it's text or some other way, Ginger is actually very interesting in the way that they're able to collect data about somebody, and then they have end results as well in order to be able to train it. But that is the fundamental difficulty here, is that the mode of intervention should also be something that people are comfortable giving data to, especially when they're at the depths of emotional despair, right? And whoever can solve, I think, that issue of getting really great data on a timely fashion in a way that's not intruding will create an incredible sort of data set to understand the challenge and also be able to intervene. And I really think that has to happen in a potentially software-driven way or technology-driven way, because it's very hard for people to get that sort of feedback from other people in a very timely manner. It's just difficult.
And there's so much about healthcare right now where, you're interacting with clinician, but there are machines, there is data that is collecting lab results, and the lab just says, and we're used to that in other parts of healthcare. For mental health care, that's a real shift in sort of paradigm for us, because we're still operating, Eric, as if it is the 1800s, and we're having a housewife come sit on our couch while we're sort of taking some notes. And so mental health care providers and the whole system would have to adapt to a very different way of conceptualizing our work and responding to people's needs. And so there you talk about a policy change, you talk about practical innovations in building databases and collecting data sets, but then there would have to be changes in practice and system changes and incentive and billing changes and so this is why we do this chat. We have a lot of fun. We talk about things like pap smears. Sorry, Chris Maxwell's mom. But truthfully, we're also talking about really a very, very big fundamental change that we think will address a very pressing public health problem. Bart, have you had a chance to surveil the feed, because it's going so fast?
There's so much. Eric, the SPSM crowd is just grooving on this so much. People are thinking about this, and I think one of the things is I'm looking that's really connecting me is this need for real-time data. And I don't know who the guest was. We reviewed a study not too long ago, April, that showed that there was this progression process in people at risk of suicide on their Twitter stream, and their complaints as they neared the attempt, the complaints stopped being about their mood, about their emotions. It was more about physical complaints.
That's my release date, Bart.
Oh, it isn't?
For more on this data, come to AAS, where you'll be hearing a presentation where this data will be released to you from Dr. Craig Bryan.
No. Well, anyway, I think it's important, aside from that, and I do make stuff up, and everybody in SPSM knows that sometimes I just make stuff up.
Craig is going to be on the show even talking about it, but yes, he was sort of giving us remember the tease.
The tease. And I don't know, I could make stuff up. But I think that the sense that having live data and having a stream so you can see changes in behavior are going to be particularly predictive. So where do we go and get that data? Ginger.io is actually tracking people that are participating, and so they're seeing them kind of in live time and what's going on with them, what they're doing, what they're not doing. And I can see some ways that we can build in those features. Think about all the things we click on, all the devices and apps that we have, and you give permission to do this and that. I don't even know what I've agreed to at this point, given the number of things that I've joined over the last few years. Right? Yeah, no,
what is it? You have to spend 75 years providing informed consent?
Yeah.
Eric, do you have any commentary?
Well, So the interesting thing is that you don't have to go all the way to making an app or even having, let's say, the Twitter feeds or social media, which I think is actually really interesting. There is some, sample bias there that you can sort of statistics out, right? You have an outcome variable of whether somebody committed suicide or not, and then you have some sort of mental or mental communication via Twitter, which I think is really interesting, and people are showing results there. But I think if there's an ability to take, well, mainly retrospective data, but start small in an environment. Let's say it's a test group within the VA. You have a pretty, homogeneous system. I mean, it's actually not that homogeneous, but take a specific area. And one of the things that came out of our hackathon was actually a sort of case planning interface that had a predictive model behind it. And essentially, all it did was it took information about the end outcomes for an individual, took the survey results that they had over time, and then identified some sort of risk score. From there, it flagged them as, you should follow up with this person, you should interact with them more frequently to see what's going on, right? And then for other ones, they're like, no, this person is probably pretty low risk. And one of the interesting things out of there is it was a pretty basic demonstration. But let's say that you had a more rigorous way of collecting that information in a small test group, right? But if you could train a model to say, hey, this person probably you should follow up with more. And then you do a systematic way of just following up with that person more instead of saying, well, I'll follow up with them every 2 weeks or something like that, right? Maybe I can follow up with that person more frequently. Then you can make it more techie by saying, I can do SMS and automatically follow up with them and get their mood and, do all these sorts of things. Like, that's possible. But even if we had a data set,
something like that. Anyway, go ahead.
So, sorry, what did you say? You were going to.
Well, about doing SMS, where like sort of automatically checking, getting mood, and getting flags of people to like based on what they're charting every day, getting flags of people to attend to, so that you can look at your whole caseload and know of everyone that you've identified as generally at high risk, and know who you need to just like who are the 3 patients you need to attend to that day.
Right.
Working on it. Anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, and and I think that's something that's become more of a common thought in health. It really depends on the rigor that you develop the model with, right? And you probably have to do a pretty substantial data collection effort in order to build a model like that. But if you could, then you could dictate, at least in the immediate patient to doctor sort of care or clinician care, you really could be able to influence some of those outcomes in a way that doesn't require the most advanced artificial intelligence thing, right, to reach out to people. You could do something pretty, from a technology standpoint, pretty simplistic. And there's actually a pretty cool company out there that doesn't have the risk modeling part, but one of my good friends founded Care Message, the nonprofit,
yes,
which is really cool, right? It for diabetics it automates sort of
I know about
effectively, them. Right? And they're doing really great work, and you could make that more sophisticated. But even that level of follow-up, let's say you were to use Care Message's data set applied to a mental health instance, you might be able to find some really interesting things that you could tailor clinical outcomes towards.
Bart, go ahead and chime in. I see it on your face.
Well, so many times in the last year, it's becoming obvious to me that we've been looking in the wrong direction to solve some of our suicide prevention problems. And when somebody like Eric steps up to the plate and starts talking about how we can use data and programming, because more and more we're living in a digital sphere, right? I mean, that's just the way that it is. Most of us are living in a digital sphere. And this is the sort of thing that's going to happen and has to happen. The other thing I love about what he's saying is we're starting to take a public health approach to suicide, which is something that is so sadly missing. I literally have people. There was a tweet today where somebody's like, somebody tweeted out something about suicide and public health. I'm like, well, you can't really say suicide's a medical health problem, right? And this was an educated PhD level person, right? So we're still locked in this mindset that suicide is this other thing that it doesn't belong in the public health sphere. And folks like Eric with these bright young brains on these kids, giving me an SPS.
We've just called Forbes 30 under 30 a kid. Way to go, Bart. That makes us fogies.
I'm old. Everybody, when you get to my age, everybody's a kid. You know what I'm talking about.
I know. It's happened. It's happened. All my patients are my children's age.
So this sort of thing's going to change. These are game changers, right? And I think that you can just hear him. He's thinking through these problems in ways that you don't hear folks in the mental health community thinking about. You start talking about artificial intelligence, and the mental health folks start losing their shit, to be quite honest, right? They don't. It's scary and new and frightening.
Well, let's be really clear that it's also going to affect how we do our job, and not everybody is going to be ready to move forward. And so you would be a dope if you were like, I learned how to do reflective listening and Rogerian, unconditional positive regard, and now you're telling me I'm going to do algorithms? Wait a minute. We're asking people. We're asking the mental health system and people who are invested in the old infrastructure to think very, very differently, and that's.
You're also assuming that people are really good at unconditional positive regard, and I would actually say that they suck at it. That's my 2 cents.
Go ahead, Eric.
Yeah, one of this is sort of the push and pull of this space is that human interaction is incredibly important for this issue, right? Like a lot of the care when it comes to therapy is really, it's therapy, right? That's how it works. One of the things, though, that is specific to mental health care is that a lot of the interventions actually don't require in-person, and when we think about it as a public health issue, if you look at multiple factors, then yes, like we are potentially missing part of that diagnosis. But when you look at, companies like, Doctor on Demand, right, and they've launched their psychology product, and when you look at telemedicine in general, right, you can actually deliver care remotely, and it has been proven out to be pretty effective. And so if you can take that where actually it's sort of counterintuitive that less human interaction but more pointed care might actually be helpful for people that have difficulty reaching out to friends and family and caregivers when they're really at the bottom of things, right? And so there probably will be this pretty dramatic shift if we can rigorously prove that non-direct methods of intervention provide a lot of care, specifically developed or distributed via technology. But what does that mean for this space in general? How would caregivers need to be retrained and all those sorts of things, right, if that's a thing? And I always believe that there needs to be a human on the other side. But is it that we're sitting down next to each other for multiple sessions, or is it something where we can deliver care more immediately through through text, call, phone,
coaching.
Right?
So yeah, has anyone talked with you about DBT coaching? I know we're at the last couple minutes. We'll do this another time. I just realized we've got to do final thoughts because it's gone that fast, Eric.
Yeah,
so,
whoa, it's almost towards the end. It's been a
I
long time.
know, it's amazing. So we're getting to the last couple of minutes. We are super glad that you have joined us. I can't believe I let us get this far without getting ready to do the wrap-up. Please do, if you take a minute as you're finishing up this evening, please do go through the feed, retweet some of the better tweets. We had several people, Eric, let you know about databases that they think may be useful, or data sets. I'm not sure. It's happened to me again. But they've actually posted links to some things, and you may know about or you may not. Some of them were news to me. Please do amplify those folks by going through the feed and retweeting. I'm going to give you my final thought for tonight. We're going to sort of go through the line, and we'll wrap up. My final thought, of course, is that we need more people thinking through not the problems and the systems of yesterday, but the solutions and the system of tomorrow, because it's time to build it. We have the stuff. It's here now. Let's get started. That's my final thought. Bart.
My final thoughts is that the mental health care system and suicide prevention system are working so well now. Why do we want to jack around with it? I'm going to dig in here a little bit because it's going pretty good.
Like a Swiss watch, Bart.
Thank you, Eric. This was amazing. I can't wait to hear more from what you guys are doing. Another great show, and I think I just want to say for all that you're doing, given all the other things you can do with your talents, that you're dedicating your time, energy, and brain power to suicide prevention is heartwarming to me. So thank you very, very much, sir.
Eric, any final thoughts for us?
Well, I appreciate that, and thanks for having me on the show. If there's one thought that I'd like to leave is around the idea of connecting people, right, around this issue, because when we're sitting here in Silicon Valley, we really understand how advertising networks work, right? how to sell more loans to other people, how to get somebody on the next dating app or the other movie that you need to watch on Netflix, right? But what I think is really important here is there is a huge demand for people to work on real problems. Like, that's why I founded this organization. That's why we've been able to activate the Silicon Valley community to do stuff effectively for free that's taking them away from building, whatever XYZ dating app that they would be building.
Just to sell you more shoes,
Right.
which we all love.
Right. And, what I think is really important here is that this connection between people that work every day in this space, right, that care a ton about people that have problems in mental health and in understanding these very deep-rooted challenges, having an opportunity for those people to connect. That's the key in order, and in ways where we're actually building stuff together, right? It's not just, let's just trade notes and those sorts of things. If we can come together and say, okay, you know a ton about this problem. We have some techniques that might be able to help. How do we create the spaces for that to happen? And then when we have ideas, how do we take that and start building around it, right? This can go from, when we're talking about the VA, that can be a way where if people build great things, how can we distribute it within the VA, right? How can we get people to start using it? What are the channels so that we can build sustainable organizations around these ideas? But also, it starts from this connection. And part of what we do is try to build that connection. And part of what's really great about this show is also being able to do that, right? To share thoughts. So I appreciate everybody taking the time, and this has been a lot of fun.
We are so glad to have you, Eric. If people want to learn more about the hackathon coming up, can you give the dates and really quickly the link? I know we tweeted it out, but let people know where to find out more about it.
Yeah, it's on bayshack.org, and it is on April 23rd. We'll have about 500 engineers out, and suicide prevention, yeah, it's going to be a big one.
Wow.
And we're flying out chief technology officers, chief data officers from a ton of different federal agencies, but one specifically relevant to this is HHS and the VA. Folks are coming out, and we're focusing on a joint mental health and suicide prevention challenge prompt there. So we'll get a bunch of interesting stuff, and if you guys are all interested, we are looking for people that really understand the space and want to guide some of these participants to build some pretty cool stuff.
And as we get closer to that, I'll try to make sure that any relevant content or any streaming or social media content, SPSMers who aren't there can follow along. I know that this is very important to many members of our community. Eric, we're so glad to have you. Any final thoughts from Tony before I close us out?
My goodness, Eric, what a lively feed you have to review when you get off this. We've rarely seen this much engagement.
So you've spent another hour with SPSM. It's Sunday night. It's daylight savings. So really, it's actually an hour earlier. Drink more coffee. Stay up late. Retweet some of the feed. I know this has been a very, very conversation and content-rich feed. Make sure you get the best bits out. Follow us on Facebook at our SPSM page so that you can be alerted to future chats. We have some really great stuff planned for the rest of the spring season before we go into summer hiatus. And AAS conference is coming up. Julie Cyril says, hey, I know you need to get with Noreen if you're interested in going out for comedy night. A lot of SPSMers are doing it. And just a little bit of an aside, a bunch of people are bringing their Stay shirt, not wink wink Desiree Stage, and they're all probably going to wear it. So you may want to be cool. On that particular note, see several of you in a couple of weeks. Have a lovely evening. Take care. Bye.
Good night. Don't forget to get scraped.
Bye.